So good. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to the audience and, of course, to this illustrious group of panelists we've gathered for the discussion today. My name is Merek Gaugler. I'm a member of the GESDA Impact Forum, and I'll just spend a few minutes introducing myself and setting the scene here for the first set of questions that I've come up with for this group. And later on, I think we'll keep quite an open mind and just see where the discussion takes us. Now, you've seen we have a very diverse group of panelists today, and quite serendipitously, actually, some of their experiences and expertises overlap with different hats I have worn throughout the different stages of my career. But I want to be super honest here. All of your CVs are extremely daunting to me, so I really hope and expect to learn a lot from each and every one of you here over the next hour. So I started out in a lab. I actually got a PhD in neuroscience about half a lifetime ago. I managed public equity funds at a private bank for nearly a decade, some of them thematic strategies. I was a partner at a large healthcare venture fund. And most recently, I have been exploring ways in which to work with very large financial organizations, advising a very large pension fund in North America and multiple private equities on a real medium to long-term strategy in the life sciences. And on the other hand of the spectrum, I've been working with very young companies in the healthcare space who had money thrown at them 2 years ago, but today have to completely rethink how and who to approach for money and to help them carry out their vision. We've heard a lot about GESDA's radar earlier today, and that's really the foundation's crown jewel, or how Mr. Brabeck said, it's raison d'être. But the radar is really not where the puck stops here. GESDA isn't only there by its bylaws to go out into the labs and anticipate what breakthroughs may come. But part of its task is really to take those breakthroughs and make sure that they foster them and give them the right partner network to make them go out in the world and live, hopefully. To that end, GESDA's different fora and panels don't only have privileged feet on the ground in the labs and speak to a lot of the most prominent and promising scientists around the globe, but their different members also have extremely privileged accesses to governments, to non-for-profit organizations, and to the industry. So what I'd like to do today on this panel is really just to gather ideas and different views here among us on what coming out of that radar is actually worth fostering. What is realistically something that can be translated and made to live in the real world? And who we might, as a foundation, engage to come in as a valuable and right partner to help foster, again, that vision. And last year, same time, at GESDA Summit, an investment panel focused on finding the right partner in the framework of an SDG target. That is not what I want to do today. We'll take a different approach here, and I hope you'll forgive me, but we'll actually just be talking about the base pots of money. And I don't want to stop there either. I thought of taking 2 steps back with you today and in 2 different directions. The first direction is to look a little bit more broadly at what sparks, what constitutes, what fosters, what hinders innovation. And I want to expressly introduce a macroeconomic view into that, because none of this innovation translation happens in a vacuum. Now, on the macroeconomic view, I really don't want to spend too much time here setting the scene or mapping out different scenarios of where the next couple of years might take us. So what I want to leave for you as a background is just, we've very recently come out of a 15-year bubble, a bubble of nearly free capital, and that drove a lot of excesses. It drove insatiable appetite for growth and anything that had transformation written on it, and it drove absolutely bottomless patience with that transformation until it generated some real-world use case and started making money. But the world's really changed over the past 18 months. We went from very low inflation for a very long time to, at the very least, more unpredictable inflation. And we went from extremely low cost of capital to something that, if it's not consistently in considerably higher rates, then again, probably at the very least, much, much less predictable. And so that's really what I'd like to map out in the first sort of rear mirror. The other step back I'd like to take is a bit more of an exercise in playing devil's advocate. If we're looking at what it will take today or going forward to bring the right partners in here who might have an interest in these innovations and initiatives, and how that's shaped by the broader state the world is in, I want to turn that on its head, and I'll put that question to some of you. What if we actually asked if there's any potential distortion that 15-year bubble of free capital has introduced in the way we think about breakthrough innovation today, right? Everything and anything was funded. May we have over-eagerly placed a lot of tools at scientists' disposal that actually don't answer a question? At the very least, that is a question I want to throw on the table and see where we go with it. But enough about setting the scene, enough about me. I would like to kick this discussion round off here, and I'd like to actually start with Ian at the very end. And I apologize to all the panelists in advance here. I'm going to give very brief introductions on each of you. They don't do your backgrounds any kind of justice, so to the audience, please go and look at their full CVs. They're available with the program. So Ian, you are the chair in experimental physics at Imperial College, but you're also the provost at that college. And I find it very impressive, in addition to your active work that you're continuing in quantum processing, you're one of the owners for setting the strategy of the school and where they want to drive that innovation and research, and what they want to see have an impact, right? And so, if you'll permit me, I'd love to set the scene by you telling us a little bit about the different pots of funding that Imperial is getting, and whether or not that has any significant influence on the kind of research you think worthy to foster, right? And I'm really thinking of that oversimplified pairing of a private institution and focus on startups, or government money, taxpayer money, and more basic research. So please open with that.
Thank you, Merit. Yes, very, very happy to do so. So I think we are not unique among academic institutions, of course, but share the same concept that we take ideas and we deliver impact from those ideas. So it is a dual mission, it's been around for many hundreds of years, of deriving and discovering new knowledge about the world and using that knowledge to make a difference to the world. So how do we go about that? There's three main strands, I would say. One is research, so that may range from the discovery to the applied. A second is development of and skills and training, so that's an education component. And a third is innovation, so starting to push those ideas into impact. All of those sources, all of those activities are things that we generate revenue for. But to focus in particular on your question around research, I think I would frame it as an ideas ecosystem. And there are several elements to that I would point to. One is you need ideas to be generated, to be developed, and then assessed as well as applied. And therefore you need a means to have a critical mass, a means for collaboration and competition, and you need the resource, the energy to drive that system. So we frame our activity at Imperial around strength of disciplines, so 28 different departments, which then have a strong set of interdisciplinary bridges. And our strategy has sort of 4 broad thrusts: sustainable society, healthy society, resilient society, and smart society. And that's kind of how we frame what we do. And then we go out and seek resources to support that mission. So, of course, that requires an element of risk itself. You don't always get the money you want. And where the money is available, you also seek to see how you can capitalize on it. But I think we would take the view that it's very much an ideas-driven system. On top of that, you do need a layer where you can pick up the ideas that have some immediacy for impact. And that's the interface, I think, perhaps more to your world, where we have to de-risk some of the ideas that we can spin out and commercialize and then push them into places where products and services can emerge. But that's kind of the boundary of what we do. But I think it's really across the entire set of academic endeavor and research institute endeavor and what have you, to be building that ecosystem at the mass that you're pursuing lots of transformative ideas. The probability that any one of them will be successful is small, but if you have enough of them, the probability that some number will be successful is high, and that's where we need to be.
And Ian, in that capacity, you've seen a lot of different disciplines, right? And I'm just wondering, over the years, were there any innovations or research areas that you thought would go on to change the world and pretty fast, and so far they've surprised you and not really innovated any aspect of our lives or gone anywhere at all?
Well, if I push my ecosystem concept a little too far, I would say that revolution is actually evolution. So if you look at many of the ideas that are now having a big impact on the world, they actually have very deep roots in old ideas. So AI, you go back to the Hopfield associative networks from the early 1980s, based on even earlier work from Japanese colleagues, for example. Quantum, the first idea of quantum computation is voiced by Richard Feynman in 1982, 1983. And there's a whole series of developments that take it to a point now where you can begin to see that the elements are right to put it into a set of actions that can really have an impact on the world. So I think that I would frame it as it's getting the timing right rather than getting the idea right. Usually you find that these things take a while to seed. That's
very interesting. Bill, I'd like to put the next question to you. So Bill Egby, just to introduce him briefly to everyone, is a managing partner at Vibranium Capital Group, and they're focusing on tech-enabled investments mostly in Africa. Before that, Bill was at Coca-Cola for nearly 20 years, among other positions as president of Coca-Cola's business in sub-Saharan Africa and president of their business in Southern Africa. And prior to that, which I find very interesting, Bill worked in very diverse roles and geographies in a couple of very different companies, AT&T, British Petroleum, and Kodak. And I'd really like to start and pick up on that broad and diverse industry experience of yours, Bill. We've briefly touched on that different lay of land, probably here on the macroeconomic scene going forward. And if there's less willingness of industry strategic partners or pure financial partners to come into investments with a true long-term view, also on payback times, do you think industry is going to jump into that breach increasingly? And if so, you having seen very different sectors along your career, Who do you actually think among those industries or sectors is best or fastest, most efficient at translating innovation?
Yeah, thanks, Merit. It's an interesting question because I think if you think of this from the perspective of the emerging markets, which tend to be not the focus of large investments to advance and accelerate technology, it's quite clear which sectors tend to attract the bulk of the investment. It would be the things where the investors can generate some significant or reasonable returns. And those tend to be sectors that are heavily focused on driving technology to improve commodities or consumer goods, where they can sell at good margins. And that's where investments have moved in the past. And in a period where there's subpar performance in those key sectors, and there's more hesitancy around allocating capital to those kinds of markets, you would find that the highest leverage places to put your money would be, from a tech-enabled space, would be finance, of course, because the required investment to accelerate uptake and access a large addressable market is quite low, so your returns can be relatively high. Another sector where you would see still some interest would be in the healthcare space, because the addressable market is huge, the needs are quite basic, and you can transfer some technology quite easily. It doesn't have to be the most advanced. You need to bring the cost down and then scale it up quite rapidly, and you can get returns quite quickly. And as the middle class grows, the returns can be reasonable. So for me, those two are the easiest to attract foreign direct investment. Now, as that dries up, then you need new players to come into the mix. And so when private capital stops focusing on those sectors, and you stop seeing the inflows, and the commodities, there's a steady investment in those sectors. That's steady. And so the only other players who will come in are the big companies. When private capital stops coming in, then the big companies who have a lot of knowledge and traction in these areas and who need to continue to expand the addressable markets would look into these geographies to invest. They're long-term players, so they're not worried about the short-term reduction in return. So they'll play the long game. And they use these periods to take advantage of lower pricing, lower valuations to come in and make long-term bets and do roll-ups, roll up smaller competitors. So you'll see strategic investors coming in and still playing that role. And I think that you see that happening in Africa. You see that in the financial sector, in banking, in financial services. You see it in agriculture. You see it in food and beverage industry, in cosmetics, which is, it's expanding quite rapidly across the continent. A little bit in agriculture, people making some strategic bets there. And so that's one bucket of capital that keeps coming. And I believe the advantage of that kind of capital is that, one, the strategics, they tend to invest a lot in R&D. They used to invest in R&D. So if they need to adapt technology to the environment, they'll make the investments required. Secondly, they tend to be able, they know they're not the best at doing early stage stuff, moving from the lab to the marketplace. So they would invest through other smaller players and support them. And then see how the business develops. The third is that they're able to afford to experiment a lot at that point where you're trying to figure out where is the business model going to work. So if you're trying to make that transition from the R&D to that phase of development where you're accelerating and you're starting to scale up and you need to experiment to address different consumer groups, they're willing to experiment and they can pivot quite quickly. So there's certain advantages of them coming in. But on the other hand, they want to protect their core business. So if they see competing technology, that's going to threaten their core business, sometimes they have the wrong behavior in terms of suppressing that to protect their core business. So there's always a watch out. Sometimes they invest just to make sure they have a foot in the door, prevent anybody else from swooping in, and they keep an eye on how that technology is developing. So that's the one downside of them coming in as investors.
Thank you, Bill. And I've heard you say that one of your personal key motivations for coming to GESDA and helping the foundation is to ensure that there's early and consistent and equitable access to that breakthrough knowledge generation, right? Just wondering, to make this a little bit more concrete, right? If you've looked at the last radar, what are the initiatives or fields of research that get you the most excited? And on top of that, what in your mind is the right stage then to pull these innovations out of, you know, their birthplaces and into a very different geography?
Yeah, so again, if I apply, as somebody who invests mostly in emerging markets, if I apply the lens of, you know, which of the scientific platforms we have the, you know, have the breakthroughs that can have the most impact on the continent, I tend to prioritize 3 out of the 5. Not that there's stuff in all 5, but when I look at eco-regeneration and geoengineering, for me, that's the top area where there's a lot of leverage in some of the breakthroughs that are happening there. I look at the knowledge foundations, especially around the future of education. I think there's huge leverage there. And then I also think when you look at science and diplomacy, some of the stuff that's going to help build more robust democracies in Africa, I think, and in Latin America could help. You know, so I look at those 3 platforms as the ones that have the most, because they deal with things that can transform lives today very quickly, even with very little breakthroughs. Just by transferring some of the knowledge and expertise, you could really accelerate reduction of poverty, of loss of life, you know, just by scaling up the healthcare systems and transferring some basic technology. So for me, those 3 scientific platforms are the ones that, you know, tend to resonate the most for me. But when you dig deeper, there are a couple of them that are really high leverage. For most of these emerging markets, a fundamental lever for them to accelerate their development, they need to have functional and high-performing democratic systems. Without that, you're just spinning your wheels. You will take 2 steps forward and 3 back. And that's just fundamental. So to the extent that you can leverage technology, especially around building more robust democratic systems, preventing the common practices of people stifling communication and debate, censoring communication, or problems with elections. The digital identities are things that are quite important in transforming how elections are run in emerging markets. Some of those kinds of technologies are very fundamental in helping to strengthen the democracies on the continent. If you look at an area like building resilience in agriculture, again, subsistence agriculture in emerging markets performs at a level that's 1/3 of the performance of more developed markets. And most of that is about access to basic technology adapted to that environment, and then access to just information. And so those are high leverage transfers of expertise and knowledge that could have huge impact on providing access to food, to financial resources in these markets. And that doesn't require even the stuff that's just in the 5-year horizon. Stuff that's already in the rearview mirror in developed markets is very important. But definitely resilience in farming is fundamental. You need to improve productivity, you have large populations to feed. So I think when I look at those, for me, those 2 areas, and of course the 3rd one, I will not talk about it, but it's obvious to everybody, the future of education, more adapted approaches to provide access at a good quality, at a low cost, to the 200 million kids who are in schools in the developing countries, who are in school but are not learning. there has to be ways for us to leverage technology to improve the quality and access and do that in a repeatable way, day in, day out.
So this is more of a transfer of ideas that you do very early on, but then really adapt to the environment you're planting them into. Is that the right way to understand it?
Yes, I believe when you look at the cycle of development, I think in the R&D phase, normally, if you look at the typical models, 4 phases, your R&D, then you accelerate, your maturity, and then you decline. If you just look at the R&D phase, I just don't believe that there's need for a lot of focus. There's some pockets where there's some work being done to adapt R&D work to the emerging markets, but it's not very necessary. Most cases you can copy-paste. But in the accelerating phase, which is the point at which there's a lot of capital coming into the sector, because the R&D has come out of the labs, there's potential. There's a lot of interest to expand the addressable market. That's how capital comes in, if your addressable market is growing. So that's where you're able to attract those kinds of investments in emerging markets. So for me, that's a cycle. That's the phase. That's a phase during the life cycle where you can get these emerging markets to participate, because they have some similar needs. They may not have the affordability, but they have similar needs. So that's the part of the life cycle before you get to maturity where you can introduce, and in most cases, it's just a copy-paste.
That's very helpful, Bill. Thank you. And Henrietta, I'd like to introduce you next up. Henrietta Fore, it's a pleasure to have you here on this panel. Henrietta was at the head of the UNICEF organization until 2018, and she previously served as the administrator of USAID and the director of the United States Foreign Assistance. Henrietta has been on such a long list, has been and is on such a long list of prestigious boards that I won't even start to enumerate. And I think your experience and expertise is so vast, I could have tried to tackle any of these topics with you today, but I'd like to benefit from your presence and just zoom out again and really ask questions about two very broad topics here. First up, I know you've spent some time with GESDA's big radar book, and I'm just wondering, taking 4 steps back, what are the initiatives in there that got you most excited? And to take a slightly different angle to the financial or strategic capital influx that we've been tackling here, what are the initiatives you think lend themselves most to attract consistent, sustainable government and non-for-profit funding?
Thank you, Merit. Well, let me build on some of Bill's comments, because the world that I have seen is a very inclusive world and a very broad world, but it's quite different around the world. So I would love to see everyone in the world be connected to the internet. Every school, every child, every teacher, because I worry that our world is sort of pulling apart the developed world that has access to digital anything and the developing world that is being left behind in our digital scope. So when I look at things like the radar, I try to think about the basics of how we reach all the people with a few very important scaling up of breakthroughs. And for people and the planet and the animals on the planet, it's really back to basics. It's things like water and food and education and health and protection. And it's a very interesting but basic set of needs. So when I was traveling the world, there seemed to be 4 big revolutions that were going on in the last 2 years or so, 2 or 3 years. One certainly is the education revolution. One is the revolution in finance. One is the revolution in agriculture, sort of the ag tech. And then when you look more deeply at education, it begins to break into several parts. So with big revolutions like that moving on in the world, couldn't our breakthroughs on the radar, and as we are thinking centered in Geneva, but with scientists all around the world, could we give them some areas to solve, some things that would really change our world? And I know that as I work in government agencies, the one thing you want is you want to be able to see into the future. So I would love to know if there's going to be a drought in the Horn of Africa, how long it will be, where exactly it will be, because the herders will start to move into the farmers and we will have conflict. I would love to know if there's an epidemic, and if it's starting in Goma, where the people in that region will go. Will they go to Beni or Butembo? And we did this under Ebola, and it meant that we could contain an epidemic because we knew where people were going. It meant that we could put supplies there. It meant that we could look after people. So the ability to see into the future is probably the most important thing you want when you're doing large public sector entities. But then as you travel the world, you see also that people don't have a recycled economy. They don't have a circular economy. So when we were moving the vaccines for Ebola, we would see gowns and masks and syringes lying on the roadways, and we would see the fact that our doctors and nurses didn't have water and a bar of soap to wash their hands. They're very basic, but if we in the breakthrough could focus on some of the things that are just part of everyday life in the developing world, it would really be helpful. So I look at the things that save energy, that are inexpensive, that can be done at room temperature, that last longer. All of these, so it has to do with material science, membranes that allow blood to be deoxygenated, yet you could hold it longer rather than having us throw out blood after 6 weeks. It just goes on and on. So health, I think, is one of the most important. And because we're in Geneva and we are a hub for science and diplomacy, Geneva is also a hub for finance. I would love to see public-private finance back some of these breakthroughs so that we can actually move. The speed with which our world moves on great ideas is quite slow. And we don't do it in public and private sectors. We don't blend our finance. We don't layer our finance in the way that we could. So I think there's enormous potential, and I look at the radar as being an exceptional resource. It's a treasure for all of us to put public and private initiative behind areas that can work for the betterment of the world.
Thank you so much, Henrietta. And I think we've just heard Bill say the people who he still sees taking a long-term view and long-term bets are people who have a very clear strategic idea of roll-up or building a platform and sort of have the finished, more mature product in mind from the get-go. That was one of the questions I actually wanted to ask you, Henrietta. Do you think that, with people being, or financial investors at least, some strategics as well, more reluctant to take on that transformation because it might be long in the tooth, right? That we could mitigate that by actually bringing more than one stakeholder to the table from the get-go. And I really find that a beautiful concept in the context of GESDA, right? Is this, in your mind, a platform that could serve exactly that purpose, right? Make sure that these ideas aren't just brought to one party, one person, but that you actually build an ecosystem of stakeholders around the table day one.
Yes, GESDA is made for great partnerships, and that brokering, that connection is the secret sauce for moving these wonderful breakthroughs out into the world. Because, if you're cooking in the labs of the world, you may not be thinking about your business plan, you won't be thinking about who the customers are, but all of that could be done, and so we could create a better world for everyone.
Thank you. Julia, I'd like to move on to you next. So Julia Angelis here. Let me briefly introduce her. Julia is a partner at Baillie Gifford, where she co-founded its first thematic strategy. And she also co-manages its international growth strategy there, which focuses on investing in high growth companies across different sectors and, I assume, geographies. Julia is also the person responsible for the academic relationships of the firm, if I've understood right. And Julia, just as we touched on with Henrietta, what I'd love to tackle with you is actually the value add of GESDA to what you do. So if we zoom out, right, we've seen that the world sort of flipped the switch. We've gone from transformation being king of the hill and losing money being just fine to a little bit more of a cautious stance. And at the same time, at least to me, it doesn't look like we're going to have a miraculous jumpstart of underlying economic growth here anytime soon either. So thematic strategies, growth, structural growth themes are probably still very relevant. And at least in my mind, some of the things that made the most money or were, in quotation marks, the easiest to play in recent years were the big changes in regulations, right? What, again, comes to my mind is energy transition, which just opened the floodgates on a ton of innovation being sponsored and financed. So I just wonder what the radar does for you there. What exactly are you looking for when you comb through that document? Is it useful?
Oh, it is very useful. So maybe just taking a step back. So we are long-term growth investors, and long-term is probably a key word here, be it taking 5 and 10 years horizon. So we're really looking for transformative changes across many different industries. And sometimes it really requires a lot of creativity, imagination, and where do you source ideas for the long term? You need to go down to academic bench and explore what actually science is cooking in their labs. And even though it's not investable still for us, that already informs us how potentially future could look like. And I always say serendipity favors prepared mind. So this is a way we prepare our minds by talking to academia, by building those relationships. Even the ideas could be as wacky as they can be, we are still interested in those, because sometimes, as also Ian was talking, they're trying to find those ideas who are very risky, potentially not going to work out, but some of those going to work out. And you need to cast your net as wide as possible to get exposure to those. And then what we do, we take those ideas and we start building scenarios to see how actually the world could look like in 10, 15 years' time. Is those scientific discoveries actually going to come to fruition? And then, so we're building those kind of waves of change, long-term waves of change. And then on the back of those, we start kind of scaling back and say, okay, what needs to happen for those to materialize? And what type of companies actually could be on those paths, to drive those change? And of course, there is many, many other different steps to get there. But the whole idea, you kind of start top down. You take really science fiction view almost to kind of the future. And then you try to bring it to the reality and try to think about what actually are the risking stages towards that kind of science fiction future. And we know that science fiction very often becomes a reality, and that's what we are sort of investing in.
And Julia, we've seen the massive change here in the macro backdrop, and we've seen a very significant rethink on part of investors, right? What do they favor, what don't they favor? So just wondering, in the context of the strategies you run, if the old framework still totally holds, or if you've started, maybe weighing some of those parameters of what you think is a promising investment a little bit differently here compared to 18 months, 2 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, we always say we are bottom-up investors, and still macro does matter to us, but it matters to an extent. And it matters probably more for life science industry, biotech businesses who depend on capital markets. And when macro shifts, as we already discussed, those companies become the victims of the capital markets. So for us, but what actually doesn't change is innovation. Macro doesn't cancel innovation. And as we know, human ingenuity has no limitations, and we're always going to have problems that needs to be solving, and those problems not going away. So if you take a step back and thinking, yeah, we still need solutions and innovation is not stopping, in that way you can really actually still remain quite optimistic about the future and opportunity to invest in companies that drive those solutions. So in some ways, nothing really has changed for us, the way we see the world of the future. But what, of course, has changed is the way we perceive certain investments in the context of financial resilience. Because many life science companies, independently of how wonderful science they have in their hands, and they have exceptional management teams, but if they don't have capital to continue de-risking this technology, and it gets more expensive as you advance, then those businesses becomes very, very vulnerable, and especially if they don't have a right investor base. So kind of to summarize, I would say fundamentally maybe nothing has changed, but the way we probably approach financial resilience has changed compared to 18 months ago.
Yeah, that's very, very diplomatic and very helpful. Thank you, Julia. Nick, last in line, we have Nick Roloffs, and I'm very, very happy to have you on this panel, Nick. Let me just introduce you briefly. Nick is a partner at Summa Equity, which is a Swedish private equity impact investor. Nick has 35 years of experience in life sciences and diagnostics, and he's been involved in several startups as well as a big handful of multinational companies such as Baxter, Applied Biosystems, Strategene, Biorad, Agilent. Currently, Nick sits on the board of a range of private and public companies. And I think I warned everyone at the beginning here, you'll get my pet question. That's been sort of on my mind for the last week plus. I'd like really to open another can of worms here. We've tried to shed some light on how the different macro lay of land could influence how we get these innovations out of the lab and out into the world and keep them alive. But I'd like to really turn that on its head. We've said there's been a 15 years bubble of nearly free money. Everything, anything was funded. Could that actually distort what we're getting out of those labs to some extent, of course, right? And I'm really wondering, if everything that pushed the frontiers of what we can, at least in life sciences, visualize, measure, map, was so readily supported, are we measuring some things that, it's just a box of EC placed in your lab and you're using it for better or worse, but is there a real question that scientists are answering with it? And yeah, do you have some technologies in mind that if it wasn't for the free money lift all boats just shouldn't have lived?
Yeah, so there's quite a broad question, pretty granular in terms of the answer. I think what I've seen, I've been a life science tools guy for a long time, is the ecosystem development that Ian talked about and the way that money has evolved in. And Henrietta talked about a radar looking at gaps. What it's created is not only investment for investment's sake, so to your thesis of pour free money in because you can do anything with it, but it's also created significant redundancy. And that's where I see a challenge, because at least in the life science tools, and Julia talked about companies that need to get a tool to market and how you look at that tool evolving. In life science tools, what we often see is 35 universities will receive money for the identical problem. And then 50 companies will be created to create the identical solution. And the difference in the nuance between those companies is really small, and they can't all survive. They can't compete because they're identical. They can't get enough funding because they're redundant. And the free flow of money has created a lot of zombie companies that are now out there in the marketplace. The funding has been forced to rationalize, and those companies may not survive well. And that's a problem we're seeing, because as an investor, I certainly want to bring a new technology to market. I want it to have an application. So I want that technology to survive through into the market so that it can solve a real problem. But if it's too diffused across too many companies, they may all fail. And if it is a complete redundancy, I guarantee many will fail. And we're starting to see a lot of companies failing. One example we talked about, and hate to use the COVID example because it's unique, but it's not uncommon. We've seen dozens and dozens and dozens of companies make little teeny PCR machines for infectious disease. And I actually was on an advisory board for one of them. Almost every one of those companies has failed. And hundreds of millions of dollars that could have gone somewhere else redundantly deployed. So I think that era of redundant technologies or irrelevant attribute technologies, and I don't want to belabor a long commentary, so I won't go through a list of those, but they're sitting in laboratories. They were invented because they were cool evolutions. Maybe they were evolutionarily necessary to create an evolutionary viable technology, but they are the extinct dead branch of an evolutionary tree, and a lot of money has gone there. So that has changed, and it has changed dramatically in the last 12 to 18 months.
That's very helpful, Nick, and I think I'll pick the COVID example back up and the redundancy that you speak about. I just want to push you a little further on the other aspect of my question, and maybe you'll permit me to just throw two anecdotes out there. I'll keep people anonymous, but I have a lot of friends who came up in the lab at the same time as me and who hold prestigious institutions, and by now I'm good at proofreading texts, so I get their papers sent to, and I'll, cross everything out and help them write it in a slightly different, very personal fashion. But what I noticed in 2-3 instances recently is that they were rerunning experiments on machines that were incredibly expensive, that were doing, measuring, I won't mention what, but just newfangled sorts of things that you can only recently measure. And when I asked them, what's the incremental information and why did you do that? The answer I got not once, but twice or 3 times recently is the reviewer asked explicitly for me to use that machine. And no, I don't think there's incremental additional information. And the other anecdote really is that I was with 2 companies, one last year that was raising money for a very special field of visualizing something at a subcellular single cell level. And I asked the company what the real world use case of that was. They said, I don't know, but this other company B is investing a ton and they're really good, so there must be something there. Coincidentally, which never happens, I met company B as well, and I asked them the same question, and they referred me back to company A. So again, that almost never happens, that you hear both sides, but it's the blind leading the blind. And in the process of that, 2 companies threw 100 million upwards at a problem with potentially a, right now, not super relevant question in the course of 2 years. So Nick, back to that question, is there anything sitting in these labs where, publications are hashed out and it's all very sexy and very popular, but you don't think it would have been there if not for free money, because the scientists aren't actually answering any relevant questions with it today?
Yeah, so I'll give you, at risk of getting myself in trouble, I'll give you a real example that I didn't give you when we talked. But I'll make a comment first, which is Ian's world of building ecosystems is much better at sorting out technology applications for the sake of learning and science and innovation than companies. Because companies, at the end of the day, are supposed to survive and ideally make money for their shareholders as well as improve the environment. So I'll give you a real world example. There's a hot topic right now, so this may cause some people to throw rocks at me, but about 3 years ago, or 5 years ago, the concept of doing spatial investigation of tissue for the purpose of doing omics, so multi-omics on a tissue. And let's look at the proteomic array, the genomic array, the RNA expression, transcriptomics on a tissue. Became a super hot idea. And it's a very interesting topic academically, because you need to know how drugs infiltrate into tissues if you're treating a tissue-borne problem, oncology typically. You need to know how tissues communicate with each other. These are very interesting academic problems. about a dozen companies got very significant money to explore this topic and create instrumentation, which went into the marketplace. And many of these companies, in the exuberance of 2020, these are life science tools, actually went public on the US market and had valuations aggregately of billions of dollars. And today those companies have technologies that haven't yet found a home. And academic institutions are using these technologies with good result to publish very interesting information. But these technologies are highly unlikely to become fundamental tools in drug discovery or fundamental tools in diagnostic. And these companies' valuations on the market have gone from aggregate total of about 15 billion to aggregate total of a few hundred million. And that's happened in 2 years. So there's an example where money went in chasing a technology that didn't really have a yet proven application. And maybe these will be proven as useful, but today the curve got out of the academics' hands into the commercial market and burned dollars in the backyard, if you will.
And it may be distracting the scientists.
And yes, certainly lots of sincere scientists spent lots of time that they could have used in other ways.
But sorry, can I just say?
Please, Julia. Please, go ahead.
I like your devil and trying to steer a bit, but I think we should be careful with that because, we just started with the whole genome project, and with a lot of claims being made that 98% of genome is junk. And then we completely reverse that view. And why we do need to sequence entire genome. So it's just that things can change, and sometimes what seems like redundant and useless at this stage, but if we give it enough time, then it can actually prove very valuable. And the point I agree, though, is like the amount of capital you invest at what stage to de-risk it. But yeah, we should be there should be a good balance there, how we treat those technologies.
Of course, and thank you for rebalancing it.
Yeah.
We totally agree. I think there's probably just a middle ground between, giving scientists everything you give them to play with, eventually with enough time will yield fruit. And we may have to, at least on some of these, introduce a bit of a sanity check on what things like the radar are spitting out. But Nick, I'd love to hear your view on that.
I was just going to make a comment back to Julia. I think you've made a very good point, right? We can't know what all technologies will do in the future. So there is this balance that we just heard, that we have to decide what we will invest prospectively and what we will invest reactively. But I personally was very close to the Genome Project. I worked for a company called Applied Biosystems. We made the instruments. We funded a company called Celera, a private company that did the genome early. And that promise didn't fruit for a couple of decades. So you're quite correct that we shouldn't condemn things until we understand the output. But in that case, it stayed very heavily in the hands of academics and government funding until we started to see more prospect. So I think the question is, the exuberant funding that we've seen in the last few years, and maybe the point of the comment, has been private money moving into private companies. And not so much, there has obviously been government funding in many things, but I think the exuberance has more been private money into private companies than governments need to fund research, and they are doing that. So I don't challenge any government, including US NIH, has poured tons of money out in the last 2 decades. I think every dollar of that, as far as I can tell, is well spent.
And I think just to add to your point of diffusion of capital, there is also diffusion of human capital, which doesn't allow also to increase chances of success.
Yeah, very well stated.
Well, we've really run out of time much faster than I thought. And I hope it was a little bit helpful to everyone that in addition to the bottom-up research that is GESDA's raison d'être, which is the radar, we try to introduce a little bit of a top-down view, right? And just give everyone a sense, or at least ask the question to what degree context is relevant, not only for the strategies of fostering these innovations, bring them to life in the real world, but maybe also if there's potentially some use in just introducing or keeping that context in mind when we look at what the radar is spitting out. So with that, I think we have a few short minutes to open it up to the floor. There was a person circulating, I think, with a microphone. So raise your hand, and I think they're starting at the top. They'll get to you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting panel. I just wanted someone maybe to mention about one aspect that hasn't been talked to a lot about the IP. So Ian, I know you're the Provost of Imperial, and the investors on your right are very interesting people, but I wish that someone talked about the IP and the invention behind innovative ideas.
I'm happy to say a few words about that, because it's a topic very much front of mind as we think about how do you spin out companies. And I think that there's a couple of things to bear in mind. One is, if there's no IP, then you have no company to start with. So there's got to be a way to protect it. And we have teams inside the college who work with our investigators to talk about, is this an idea that can be patented? Is it an idea that can be captured in know-how in some way? So capturing that's important. Second, there's a de-risking phase. I won't talk much about that. But then if you go to a spin-out, what's the important thing? You want to have an ability to be agile, to get things out quickly, and not to draw cash out of the spin-out in its early phases. So we have just reformed our process there to give low licensing fees, rapid way to get the IP into the company, and to maintain a small equity stake in that company for return. The bottom line is capturing IP and running that effort costs money, and we've got to have a way to completely fund the ecosystem to do that. So getting that IP out there rapidly into a company that can utilize it is a key part of that system.
Yeah, we have several questions here in this row. Yes, she's coming.
Thank you very much. I have a very related question, and I don't think that they omit to mention the IP. I think that words like ideas are actually IP. My question is about the IP commercialization and or IP collateralization or IP financing, or intangible asset making a banking intangible asset making a tangible asset. So how to do it? How to achieve that the ideas have a price tag, and that they are possibly ready to be a collateral and to be used for financing. If we want to use the future to build the present, we also need to be creative in reforming the tools which we have, for instance, for financing. So how to make it, how to make ideas valuable assets, how to make them bankable, how to make them something I can go to the bank and say, here is my, and it's not only about patents, it's the IP is a very broad term, and you know it. How to make it that you can come to bank and say, I have this and this idea, please give me a price tag on it and give me money for scaling up my business or developing my business.
So I don't know who wants to take this. Maybe Ian and Nick take a stab? Or?
I'll be very, very brief on that front. You're right, ideas have value. For a university, I would say the mission is to deliver impact on society. Sometimes that may be put in the public domain. Sometimes a company may be the best way to exploit it. But I think it's not for a university, I'd say, to put a value on its IP directly, other than what impact we can generate. And I think our colleagues here will then have a different view about how the commercial value may take off.
Yeah, I might just add a comment. I mean, I agree. You have to protect the value that got put in intellectually. And so there's got to be a system to do it. I mean, this country, one of your most famous patent people in this country was Albert Einstein, who used to write patents at the patent office or review them. You have to have a process. It's been established for hundreds of years, and investors understand IP is valuable, and then investors try to value IP. And the classic investment issue is the future is risky. Therefore, if I can value your IP in a way that we mutually enjoy the future, that's how I will invest. So royalties at a low level, if it's a massive amount of IP, can be a massive future value without much cash drain in a company. There's many tool sets that are classical, and others here, maybe Julia's done quite a bit of investing, or Bill can comment.
I've been involved in tackling that question with the ETH Foundation. So I'm on the investment committee there, and we've looked at this every way, south and back, and right and north recently. It's really, really hard, and I think it shouldn't be done for the university to try to assign a value to that. So it's too early, and it's not the right people to try to do that. So it has to be done by someone else, someone who does that for a living, and probably later down the road. So I think the models that take, like Nick outlines it, a more balanced and more flexible view of what these value share models look like are probably more adapted and promising. But that's my personal view. Yes, please.
Having very bad hearing, I will ask my question in the form of a very short testimony. Years ago, I visited 1 mile from here a show on biotechnology. And I was surprised to see the total absence of journalists beside me, and I am by far not the best. And the exhibitors and experts there said, no, journalists would attend big symposium on science communication or science policy. They never come to primary science events. The only outsiders who do are financial analysts. And I felt very humiliated to be outperformed as a journalist by financial analysts. Then, still years before that, when I started in journalism, I started late, I was contributing to a financial daily and a computer weekly. These were very exciting times. It was the time of the launch of the GESDA and the microcomputer revolution. All sectors, all actors of society were excited about science and technology, the traditional vested industry, the newcomers, the garage, the media, precisely the banks, etc. And each one with a different angle, which caused cross-fertilization, among else the downfall of IBM, which was a bit the dinosaur then. And today, on the contrary, everybody is interested, but along the same line. You all have to be in line with the SDGs, which might be ethically a step forward, but my question is, isn't it scientifically and intellectually a step backwards?
Julia, do you want to try to tackle this one briefly? I'll help you.
I don't know. I try not to sound like a politician, not answering the question and just answering the question I want to answer. So this is a health warning. But for example, our conviction in the fund I manage, that you can do both. You can make returns by creating access to innovation in health and also making money for our clients. We don't think those are contradicting each other. And those would be also aligned with SDGs. And the way we do it actually is proactively engaging with our companies in helping them to build the right relationships with public sector, for example, to get access to emerging countries, and in such a way that can also build businesses around it. And what was interesting, Henrietta was just in Copenhagen in the supply chain of UNICEF. And for example, the UNICEF big mission is actually make irrelevant getting yourself out of the business in the cases of infectious diseases. But UNICEF still matters for dealing with emergencies. But how do you get yourself out of the business? You need to work with private sector, because the most sustainable solutions come with private sector. And there I think when you find the convergence between the two, those are not contradicting. You actually help to bring technology to the broader populations and solve for access. I don't know. I hope I didn't sound like a politician.
No, you
did.
Political brainwashing, which washes all original ideas out of the brains.
Yeah, I think last year we tackled that SDG angle. Today, better or worse, that was really just not the topic we focused on. So why don't we sideline this one and discuss it further afterwards? Or Bill, do you want to weigh in?
Look, there are enough examples that, you know, there's no contradiction there. The reality is that in many areas in which we invest, if you don't go back to build an ecosystem where all the stakeholders involved, not just the shareholders, all the stakeholders benefit, eventually that ecosystem is going to fall apart. There are many examples. And so I think that debate, you know, the question is how do you balance those? And like any other challenge we have in the world, you have to balance, you know, the things that push and pull. And finding that right balance is what this is all about. And the idea that the best way to find that right balance is to make sure that it's not just the private sector looking at these opportunities. You have the public sector putting an eye and coming to the table and saying, how do we collectively, you know, how does civil society get involved? Because these are all important stakeholders in that equation. I think in the past, it was much too driven by just what shareholders and investors said. Now we realize that it's not sustainable in many industries. You need to have other stakeholders involved. And the idea of public-private partnerships is critical because that's how you make sure that the policy angle, the regulatory angle, and the impact that is generated by, you know, by these business ideas are valued and shared in a fair way. And most companies know that if that's not done, eventually you're going to run out of room. It's just a reality.
Thank you very much, Bill. Henrietta, please.
Could I just add one more thought? Often in the developed world, we think about technologies that can save jobs. But in the developing world, the question about saving a job is not what's on their mind. It's how do I get a job? I need to make more jobs. So this idea of whether you take a job or make a job is going to be one of the key questions around the technologies. And this dynamic 1.8 billion young people that are coming into our world, what they want is a job and a way to make a living. And 8 out of 10 of them are not going to have jobs like we've had jobs. So they're going to have to make their own jobs. So the more that we can help them look at some of the SDGs and look at the financing and the breakthroughs in technology, we will have a world that is more equal, that has more opportunities for them. But they are going to be a force to be reckoned with. So we've got to think about them and not just about the worlds we know now.
Thank you very much for opening that parenthesis. I think we have time for one more. Otherwise, all that remains to be... There is one more? No. All that remains to be done here from my side is to thank everyone very warmly for participating in this panel. And thanks for coming.
Thank you.